please. We are going to start our meeting. So I invite you to back to your seats. Okay, so it's my pleasure to start the first meeting of the NV committee. And we will start with the exchange of views with Mr. Minister Leppä, Minister for Agriculture and Forestry. It's a pleasure to have you here in Brussels today. We have 1 hour and 30 minutes together. So in order to make sure that all the MEPs who would like to have the floor will be able to do so, I will be quite tough on time restriction. So after the minutes allocated, and you know that, 2 minutes for coordinators and 1 minute for the other MEPs, I will be forced to invite you to stop and give the floor for other questions or for the answers. So I will not hesitate to be the timekeeper. So, Mr. Minister, you have 10 to 12 minutes to start with, and then you will have 2 other opportunities to answer the questions raised by the MEPs. Up to you.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be the first minister to be heard by the committees of the new Parliament. The Parliament's role as the representative of all EU citizens is a very important one, and the Parliament's work as a defender of common European values merits thanks. This hearing is an important opportunity to have an exchange of views between the institutions. I would once again like to thank you for your election to the European Parliament and to this committee. This committee plays an important role, and I follow with great interest how you get to start your work. The Finnish presidency has lasted for 3 weeks already. I'm very pleased to be able to tell you about the policies and priorities of our presidency and to reply to any questions you might have. Many things have changed since our last presidencies. The role of the European Parliament with the Lisbon Treaty has been strengthened, and also the role of the presidency has changed. Now the European Council and the External Action Service have their own representatives, for instance. Our priorities during our current presidency include combating climate change, promoting the EU's common fundamental values and the rule of law, strengthening security, and strengthening a socially coherent union. We have large legislative files to deal with in the months to come. We seek to find a solution to the multi-annual financial framework, which is one of the most important files during our presidency. We will also try to reach an agreement on the long-term climate strategy for the EU. I consider it important that the EU act with determination to reach the Paris goals so that global warming will be restricted to 1.5 degrees. In the EU, this means that we achieve zero net emissions by 2050. During our presidency, we are also going to work on the biodiversity loss to slow it down. It's very important that the EU and its member states continue their active commitment to the preparation process of the post-2020 International Biodiversity Framework. In the Agriculture and Fisheries Council, a central theme will be the CAP reform, and will strive to make as much progress as possible to reach a common position in the Council. The CAP reform, of course, is closely connected to the progress in the MFF negotiations. In addition, the informal Agri meeting in Helsinki in September will focus on the issue of soil carbon sequestration in farming. This is an important theme when we think about how farmers can contribute to climate action. As for fisheries, we seek to achieve a general approach on those parts which are still open in the proposal on the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. During the fall, we are also going to take decisions on the total allowed catches, the TACs, for the next year. As the President of the Council, our activities are guided by principles of openness, good governance, and sustainable meeting practices. For instance, instead of giving concrete presidency gifts, we are going to offset the emissions caused by flying to meetings. The amount for offsetting emissions is €500,000, and we use this money to fund 4 compensation projects in Honduras, Vietnam, Uganda, and Laos. Ladies and gentlemen, it is important to recognize that modern problems are cross-sectoral. They are linked to several sectors, and therefore too narrow sector-specific solutions may lead to difficult consequences in other sectors. This is why tackling these problems requires broad, interdisciplinary and interinstitutional cooperation. Also, the agriculture and fisheries policies have to be in line with other policies. Next, I would like to take up some priorities which fall under your committee's competencies and on which we would like to make progress during our presidency. First of all, the CAP reform. Like I said, we seek to make as much progress as possible with the CAP reform. If the MFF moves forward, then we'll try to form a general agreement in Council. I'm very pleased to see that Member States have shown in the Council that they are committed to higher ambitions in climate and environmental questions. Healthy environment and climate and sustainably managed natural resources are a prerequisite for life, and they are also vital for agricultural production. The new architecture will increase obligatory environmental measures, and in addition to this, it will give the Member States a possibility to draw up national environmental measures under the first and second pillar. Negotiations, however, are still ongoing. As the President in office, I want to ensure that the new green architecture takes into account Member States and regions' different needs and conditions. This is how we get such environmental and climate actions and measures which are effective exactly there where they are taken. Funding and objectives need to be in balance. Then a couple of words about forests. One theme that I would like to draw your attention to is the global deforestation. Global deforestation is progressing at an alarming speed, and we need to act quickly to curb it. And when we talk about deforestation, we need to see the big picture, because sustainable solutions require all sectors to be observed. To prevent deforestation and to promote afforestation, we need sustainable forest management and forest protection. We also need to restore damaged forests. At the moment, we are awaiting a communication from the Commission on this issue. During our presidency, we are ready to promote the implementation of measures to prevent deforestation. Then a few words about Mercosur. About a month ago, we reached a political agreement on the trade deal between the European Union and Mercosur. This is a very significant trade agreement. Reaching such a result in the current political situation is not self-evident. The implications of the agreement, of course, raise concerns regarding both agricultural products and sustainability issues, and I understand these worries. Indeed, I consider it important that the Mercosur agreement contains a chapter on sustainable development. Also, the Paris Agreement and the precautionary principle are included in the agreement, and this is important. We have to see to it that when the agreement is implemented, the principles of sustainable development are observed and conditions for trade are created that satisfy both parties. In Mercosur, just like in any other international trade agreements, the safety clause is there to guarantee consumers' trust in food safety. Also, the EU's animal and plant health situation must not be compromised. In last week's Agri Council, we heard the Commission's communication on long-distance animal transports, especially during hot summer months. Live animals are transported long distances outside the Union, often in too high temperatures, which are simply above acceptable limits, and often in too tightly loaded containers. Such conditions do not meet today's requirements. I take these problems very seriously, and it's good that the Commission took this issue up last week once again. It's also a question about consumer protection. The consumers should have certainty that the whole production chain is a responsible one, and that animal well-being is observed throughout the chain. This should also go for those animals who end up outside the European Union. Last but not least, I would like to say a few words about the antimicrobial resistance. This is an extremely serious global threat to human and animal health. It's also a threat for food safety and the environment. At this juncture, I would like to thank the Parliament for your active work against antimicrobial AMR. The composition of your committee may have changed, but the issue is still topical. The EU has recently adopted a regulation on veterinary medicines which prohibits the use of antibiotics as growth promoters, as well as their prophylactic use or their use for mass medication. To curb the spread of antimicrobial resistance is of utmost importance so that current antimicrobial medicines won't lose their efficacy. The need for and the use of antibiotics could be effectively reduced by investing in animal health and well-being. Their use must be well-grounded and controlled, and they should not replace good production measures and good conduct in general. A strong determination by different actors and administrators is called for. I am pleased to see that cooperation under the theme of health is functioning and fruitful. Fighting the AMR requires global cooperation, and it is important that the EU be in the front line and show the direction in different international fora. Distinguished members of the committee, Chairman, given these multifaceted problems I have mentioned, my core task as the chair of the Agri and Fisheries Council is to ensure the safety of food security. I believe that we can attain the best end results if we also take comprehensively into account the sustainability of our institutions and act in cooperation with different sectors and institutions. I hope that during our presidency we can make progress with these priorities on our agenda, which are important for our citizens, while keeping up a good spirit of cooperation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. So, a couple of hot topics like the Mercosur or the CAP or other ones. We will have the opportunity to have exchange of views with 3 ministers from the presidency today and tomorrow. So it will give us the full scope of the priority of the presidency, and it's very important that we all have that in mind. So it's very meaningful that we spend a couple of the first exchange of views all together with the Finnish presidency, because when we hear you, Prime Minister, in Strasbourg, and we hear you today, then of course the climate goals are at the forefront of them. You mentioned biodiversity as well, so I think we might find a very good feeling here in this, and vibes in this committee when we look at your priorities. So questions now from the coordinators or their representatives chosen by the political groups. So just as a reminder for the rule, because it's the first formal meeting, each coordinator has 2 minutes for the questions, and then after the first round of coordinators, we will give you back the floor for the answers. So let's start with the EPP and Jessica Polfjard.
Thank you, Chair, and kiitos, Mr. Minister Leppä, for your statement on your priorities during your coming presidency. Both Finland and Sweden have a long history of sustainable and active forest management. It is something I'm sure that we are both proud of, and we have to share the understanding that an active forest management will help us in achieving our climate goals. Because there is no doubt, forests are very important for the climate. Well-managed forests that grow, bind carbon dioxide, and wood-based products continue to store carbon dioxide throughout their lifetime. By replacing products of coal and oil with products from sustainable used forests, we are moving towards a bioeconomy that lowers the emissions. I would therefore like to ask you what you will do to safeguard the national competence on forestry during your presidency, and how will you promote this sustainable industry? Thank you once again, and I'm looking forward to a beneficial cooperation and wish you all the luck with your upcoming work. Thank you.
Well, time-wise, you set very good bar. So, the coordinators from the Socialist Group, Christel Schaldmoser.
Tak for det. Jeg vælger at tale dansk.
Thank you very much. I'm going to choose to speak Danish since I have the opportunity. First of all, I'd like to welcome you here to the Parliament. And on behalf of S&D, can I thank you for prioritizing climate and sustainability in your presidency. These two things are very important, and I think we can get some excellent cooperation with each other. As you may know, in the Finnish presidency, that during the last term of office of the Parliament, we had a committee which focused on transparency for the approval procedure for pesticides used in agriculture. I know it's not up to the presidency to present new legislation, but nevertheless, I would like to know whether the Finnish presidency recognizes that there is a lack of independence in the way we approve pesticides in the EU. And if you do agree with that, would you be prepared to help ensure that EFSA and the Chemical Agency and other agencies have more funding so that they can carry out their own funding, that they can carry out their own studies, so we can rely on the results they come up with? So that's one question. The second question is on forestry. I think that sustainable forestry is part of the solution to the way we deal with the climate challenges, but what will you in the presidency do to ensure that the member states actually comply with the rules we've already adopted? There are countries which import illegal lumber into the EU. What are you going to do to make sure that our lumber legislation is complied with? And generally speaking, what are you going to do as presidency country to ensure that the legislation we have in place is actually complied with? But I look forward to working with you, and we're very pleased with your priorities. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Oh, thank you very much. So we move to the Renew Group. Nils Torvalds.
Kiitos, herra puheenjohtaja.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to welcome Minister Leppä to our jolly company. Of course, we could debate wolves or cormorants or cod today, because in 33 minutes the total cod ban will start in the Baltic Sea, even though there is one strain or one cod fisheries in the south of the Åland Islands, which is in good shape. And I would have expected Mr. Leppä to really defend fishers in the Åland Islands in this regard. But this didn't happen. But I don't want to waste time on questions that really reflect the tug-of-war in Finland. I'll move on. We've had interesting experiences in the past about the possibility of agriculture to work as a good carbon way of sequestrating carbon, and this has not always gone hand to hand with traditional agriculture. So I'd be interested to hear what Finland will do in regard to CAP, so that a more sustainable carbon storing, sequestrating way of doing agriculture would be a priority during the time when Finland is in charge of the CAP negotiations at the end of the Finnish presidency. Thank you.
Yannick Jadot for the Greens.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, pour votre...
Thank you, Minister, for coming along here today. I'm speaking on behalf of my coordinator, who I'm sure would have liked to talk to you about forestry in Finland and the impact on European climate legislation, but he's asked me to take the floor to take up a couple of points that you mentioned. You mentioned the Commission's communication on deforestation, which could include a paragraph on imported deforestation. As you know, there are thousands of hectares that disappear every year because of our imported deforestation, palm oil, soya, beef, etc. How do you feel about this? And are you in favor of introducing into European legislation something binding about the strategies of companies and how companies behave when it comes to whether or not they participate in deforestation? We've been able to do this with minerals, and it's high time we did it with the supply chain for forestry and agricultural products. So are you in favor of binding legislation on the supply chain? And then you mentioned Mercosur. I understand your argument, Minister. You were saying that there's a chapter on sustainable development in the agreement and that's going to solve everything. But the problem is that the sustainable development chapter is not going to solve anything. There's no sanction. And I don't think I know a single agreement where we've actually implemented the sustainable development chapter. You know that deforestation is speeding up in Brazil. Bolsonaro's policies has made it much worse. So the whole of Amazonia is in danger. Now, given that you want to balance no carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, are you going to do something to make sure that there's zero deforestation in Amazonia?
Group Tovo Akarainen.
Arvoisa puhemies.
Chairman, distinguished Minister, I would like to thank you for taking up the issue of forestry. Finland has been investing in forestry and forest management for 100 years. Now the forests have been growing more than ever, and also the carbon sink is growing. In the central Finland, almost all forests have been slashed and burnt, but biodiversity has been maintained and the forests have grown again every time. Now people say that clear fellings should be done. This is nonsense. Canada is the second largest country on the conifer zone, but they don't have any carbon sinks. When forests are not managed, they will not become carbon sinks. Forestry, forest industry is a matter of life and death in Finland. We have the sufficient know-how, the sufficient technology for it. It is self-sustained. It's not dependent on imports like other branches of industry, like metal industry. In addition to this, it produces renewable energy in the form of electricity more than it needs. And now we are living a boom in forestry. The forest use is at its maximum, and we use about 70 million cubicles of wood a year. In other words, only about 70% of the annual growth. For forest industry, it is a question of life and death that forest sinks will not be harnessed as storages of fossil emissions. Has the Minister taken this into account? Thank you.
Thank you. For ECR, Anna Zalewska.
Jestem. I'm sitting here. Dear Chair, Mr. Minister, dear colleagues, I've listened to your ambitious goals, but it's going to be a difficult, tough time because we are going to negotiate a budget. And the budget has not yet been adopted. It has been solely presented. And the budget is a budget of vanishing means for CAP. And there have been very serious cuts performed in the agricultural policy. So I'm wondering how you are going to negotiate with the European Commission and with different member states, because the European Commission is going to be constituted soon. And I guess you will try to get more more money for common agricultural policy. And my second question is, how are you going to fight inequalities? Because I think all farmers should get the same type of money. And thirdly, bureaucracy and fight with bureaucracy, how to cut red tape, how to make the bottlenecks disappear, especially in the first pillar. The European Union has been struggling with it, and I think it merits your attention. You also mentioned Mercosur while you were talking about countries that are associated within this institution, but I guess you will soon hear information from farmers, because we've been hearing news from our farmers, news or rather worries about the food safety, because we have very ambitious, very tough food safety standards, and Mercosur is lagging far behind. And so my question is, we have signed the agreement. What next? I think we have to be very severe. We have to be very tough to respect food safety standards. And my last point, of course, you are a beacon, you are a shining example how to do forest management. But I'm wondering, are you going to prepare a toolkit or some set of means how this could be maybe implemented elsewhere as well?
Thank you. For the GUE, Silvia Modig.
Kiitoksia.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Leppä, I'm very pleased that Finland has raised climate change as a priority in its presidency problem, and I'd like to raise a profile of the EU as a global climate leader. You mentioned agriculture in your speech, and that's something that's not debated enough in this regard. We always talk about the importance of cutting emissions, but it's equally important to strengthen carbon sinks, and agriculture offers a huge opportunity to sequestrate carbon. How can we make fields into carbon sinks? And I'd like to hear what concrete proposals do you have to farmers? How can we make agriculture more environmentally sustainable and climate sustainable in the CAP reform? And then a further question about carbon sinks. And many Finnish experts say that we produce too much wood and that we cannot act as carbon sinks. Should we strengthen existing carbon sinks? If the carbon sinks of the forests are reduced, no way of sequestrating carbon will help. And because there's no path as short as that of the forests. How will the sustainable use of forest resources be evident in the Finnish program? And how can we put a stop to the deterioration of biological diversity, which is also important from the point of view of forest management? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Minister, you have around 15 minutes to answer all the set of questions.
Herra puheenjohtaja, kiitoksia.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your numerous difficult questions. I am going to try to reply to what I have heard. I'll begin with forestry, because many of you talked about forests. The most important thing is the sustainability of forests. This includes good forest management. I also referred to it. It's important that the forests grow more than they are used. This is something I also know from my own experience, because I own forests. I am a farmer, and my family has been working on that area for 480 years. 480 years, and in all those years we have considered it important to take care of this environment so that the next generation would have it even better than we did. This is the most important viewpoint for us. The second important question pertains to deforestation. We have to curb deforestation. You gave me good advice on how we could oblige our trade partners to behave well. This is really important, and I want to make progress on this during our presidency. How can we do this? Finland has always believed in a rules-based cooperation, and this is our guiding principle also now. It has to do with the forestry, it has to do with bioeconomy, and somebody asked how we can ensure that we can guarantee the industry's competitivity. I think part of our industry will be based on bioeconomy, and it means that it has to adopt new technologies, make new investments, and these investments mean that industry can produce products in an environmental friendly way, and that we get new products that we can replace the fossil raw materials in the future. This is something we all have to do. This is clear as daylight. This has to happen in Europe, but the European Union has to make sure that this will also happen in the international trade. MFF. We heard many questions on MFF. It is clear that our higher ambitions in climate and environmental issues means that we need more money, more funding. And the requirements and the funding have to go hand in hand. This is why we want to cooperate with the Commission and the Member States so that we bring about a situation which is fair between the Member States, and we also need to see to it that the pillars that we have at our disposal work in line with our objectives. And the Commission's communication on the CAP reform is very good. It includes many elements which help us attain new goals, but it also helps us simplify many things. And this is really important for Finland. It's important that we can simplify things. And this also means that we have new means of acting. Digitalization is something which is new, and it will help us also in controls. And we are going to work on that field. The role of agriculture in the global system is huge. The most important task of agriculture is to produce food security. Food has to be produced sustainably so that we can maintain biodiversity, and it has to be the process has to be balanced. What this means? It means new farming technologies. It means that we have to resort to the latest research, and these results of the latest research have to be deployed all over Europe. And this is how we can strengthen our competitiveness vis-à-vis to other economic zones. This is really important. This also has to do with the question of what we cultivate and how we cultivate. We have a lot to do still, and this is why the informal Agri and Fisheries Council in Helsinki in the autumn will be focused on how we can bind more carbon in the soil, how at the same time we can improve growth, and this is how we can also get new environmental and climate benefits. This is a multifaceted question, but we want to succeed in it. Soil sequestration, carbon sequestration is of utmost importance, and it's important that we also do more research. We know more what happens on the surface of the soil than what happens inside the soil, and we have to study these matters more. And you also made a question on the situation in the Åland Islands, and you asked about the situation of cod. Well, the cod situation has degenerated, but in some parts it is also in a good condition, and we are discussing this with the Commission. It's important that the Commission also has scientific advice and information on how fish stocks develop. And of course, the situations are different in different places, and we have to observe these differences. Then about fisheries. As I said, the scientific advice is something we are going to act on as a presidency. We want sustainable fisheries, sustainable fish stocks, and we always have to look beyond tomorrow or today. And here, of course, the Commission has a lot of competencies, actually. About Mercosur. This is a very challenging agreement. Just a few days before the Agri and Fisheries Council, we received this document, and of course every member state will make their own evaluations on how this agreement will what kind of effect this treaty will have on agriculture and so on. And this process will take some time. And of course there are many question marks. That's clear. But we will have to find to these question marks. That is also clear. And of course we want to cooperate with the Parliament and the Commission, especially of course with the Commission, because Commission has significant powers in these matters. We want to go through all the questions carefully, and after careful negotiations we can take decisions. And of course I understand your worries. I understand them very well. Here too the Paris Agreement has to be abided by. We have to keep Paris in mind. Also here. I also heard a question about pesticides. It's important to understand that one of the cornerstones of the CAP reform relates to biodiversity, and this covers all aspects, also pollinators. And it is very important that we see to it that insects also feel good. And there we have to take care of pollinators, because this has a great significance on agriculture. And of course the new CAP contains many tools with which the member states can take care of biodiversity, and there are many indicators to follow that work. But of course this work is still ongoing. Green architecture. This is closely linked to the CAP reform. We already had a long discussion, a very good discussion on that question in our first Agri and Fisheries Council, and this gives us possibilities to make the necessary reforms, and it gives flexibility to member states. The member states can take into account the natural constraints and different conditions which we cannot do anything about. And I think what Commission proposes is well grounded. One example. And I know how things are taken care of in Finland. So here, and as a farmer, I can also say this. Through the second pillar in Finland, we have introduced strong incentives, and this is how we have gotten almost 90% of farmers to commit to these solutions, and this shows that we need tailor-made solutions so that we can reach the overarching goals. We have to take into account the local conditions, the local challenges, and this is one of our priorities. Something that we need to remember at all times. And to finish with a couple of words about pesticides, the authorization processes. EFSA, of course, is our tool in this. EFSA needs enough funding for their risk evaluation work. They do a lot of important work. It's very important work, and it is a basis for our risk management decisions. And as a presidency, we want to make sure that EFSA will have what it needs to do its work, because EFSA does indeed very important scientific work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are now entering the second round of questions. It will be divided in two parts. So we have 13 MEPs, 7 first, and then again, some space for answers, and then 6 additional. Otherwise, you will get a set of 13 questions, which is the best way not to answer them. So as we really want you to answer the questions, we split into 2 parts, like you did for the first round. So we start with Alexander Benhuber for the EPP.
Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Vorsitzender, sehr geehrter Herr Minister, herzlichen Dank für die
Chair, MEPs, Honourable Minister, thank you for explaining your ambitious programme. You come from an agricultural area, you're a farmer yourself. You've mentioned the protection of biodiversity. I'd like to hear a bit more about the Habitat Directive. Since 1992, the Habitats Directive hasn't been altered, but there have been many problems in recent years as regards the living together of farmers and some species. Let me give you an example. The fish otter is protected very closely under the Habitats Directive, and it has spread into many parts of Europe. Now, however, this animal is in many rivers, and it's no longer possible for this species to live with others. The same is true of the wolf. There are now several thousand wolves in Europe. 17,000 wolves make up the wolf population. And this affects farming in the alpine regions particularly. Do you think there is any possibility to amend the Habitats Directive during your presidency, or to at least look at the matter? Thank you.
Thank you. We really ask you to stick to the 1 minute per question. Mr. Sild for SND.
Sehr geehrter Herr Minister, das österreichische Parlament.
Minister, the Austrian Parliament decided that glyphosate would be banned from the 1st of January 2020. There was wide support for the ban on glyphosate in the population, but now there should be further measures on environmental poisons and the attempt to find alternatives that could be positive for farming and consumers alike. I have a question to you. What will you do on R&D to try to come up with alternatives to conventional pesticides? Thank you.
Thank you. Martin Osic for Renew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear Minister, the CAP is about the climate, the CAP is about the biodiversity, the CAP is about chemicals, but also about animal welfare. And as a number of people spoke about the carbon sinks, I won't touch that again. I want to ask about the other issue, which is very closely linked with the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the CAP, and that's the factory farming, especially of animals. And I wonder how the Finnish presidency, in the work on the upcoming CAP reform, would like to address it, because it's also linked closely with the deforestation in Amazon. So is there something that the Finnish presidency would like to look at specifically vis-à-vis the animal welfare and the overall amount of animals farmed? That's one question. The other question is on the forestry. I'm very happy to hear words about the forestry and the sustainable forestry, but sadly what is a challenge not only abroad, but also within the European Union, including my home country, is a deforestation in the highly protected areas, including Natura 2000 areas. Is there something that the Finnish presidency would like to push forward in terms of better better enforcement and protection of Natura 2000 areas? Thank you.
Thank you. Christine Schneider for the EPP.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you, Chair, Minister. Many questions on the CAP have already been put to you. And what kind of common approach can we find to the common agricultural policy? I agree with you. We can only maintain biodiversity if we have a way of working together with farmers and land managers. Can you give us some specific details about the Council position on the conference next year in China, where there should be a nature protection agreement next year? And then how will we in Europe become leaders in the maintenance of biodiversity? Then I have a question about the Mercosur agreement. Under the chapter on health and plants, you're supposed to ensure consumer protection. How are you going to maintain EU standards? And then how will you actually carry out checks on whether these standards are being complied with? Thank you.
Thank you. César Luena for SND.
Sí, gracias. Aquí. Señor Ministro.
Thank you. Minister, you talked about the CAP and the multi-annual financial framework. I must put it to you, I don't think we should be cutting the funding. The position of the Commission seems to be heading in that direction. So what we need is simplification and more flexibility, all well and good. But if you don't mind my saying so, I would be glad to see you defending the case in the Council that the funds in the CAP, given their importance, should not be touched. Secondly, on the farming and forestry sector, could you spell out some specific measures in greater detail to build up farming and forestry's contribution to fighting the climate crisis, and also in relation to the point you mentioned regarding the development of the bioeconomy? Thirdly, Mercosur, protected geographical origins are there in the draft agreement, but I'd be glad to see you continuing to defend them, and please once again defend CAP funds in the Council.
Thank you. Martin Oslik for the Greens.
Herr Minister, Sie haben die GAP-Reform angesprochen.
Minister, you mentioned the CAP reform. Do you think it's good that 2/3 of CAP funds is based on area payments without any conditions? Shouldn't we upend the system? The farmer should be paid based on what he does for the environment. I think the CAP reform is not an ambitious one. The environmental measures in the new CAP are voluntary. How is that going to combat biodiversity loss? You also mentioned the second pillar, where there's going to be a 30% cut. Well, I actually think we need more money in the second pillar. We need more money for organic farming. You know that in 2021, the new regulation on organic farming will come into force. Then there's the issue of biodiversity. And then the last question is, CRISPR-Cas has been classified as a GM technology by the ECG. Why do you, the Commission and the Council, not prevent the imports of these substances, or why don't you regulate the imports of these substances clearly? Thank you.
Thank you. Maria Spiraki for EPP.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Minister, in this House. Well, I would like to insist on 3 topics that we have already mentioned, but I think that we need maybe a kind of further information. To start with funding. Of course, in the framework of addressing our climate goals, given that the transition from a grant-based funding model is permanent, we need to address the issue of additional funding in our CAP. So, you know that the EIB has recently announced the launch of a launch package of nearly 1 billion for agriculture and bioeconomy. But I would like to ask you, how many of our farmers are going to take the advantage of this kind of loans? Secondly, is reskilling and skilling our farmers. Allow me to give you an example. In Greece, only 7% of our farmers is skilling on their jobs. And of course, it is very lower than the average that we have in the EU. What's your plan on skilling our farmers in the framework, of course, of addressing our climate change issues? And third is the question of protecting our natural capital by encouraging member states. Do you have a plan? Do you have a kind of motivation in order to start implementing our plans, the member states? Thank you, and excuse me for.
Thank you very much for this first round of questions. So, 10 minutes to answer, and then we'll back to the second round.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for these excellent questions. Oh, it's getting tougher and tougher, isn't it? There were a couple of questions that fall under the portfolio of other ministers. There was a question on the Habitat Directive. It's true that is an old directive, but it falls under the portfolio of the Environment Minister, and our Environment Minister will address this question, I'm sure. It's clear that when the environment changes, natural stocks and the situation of various species changes, things change, and it's good to reevaluate things. And the implementation of decisions in Nature 2000 areas, that also belongs to the Environment Minister. But as regards Finland, the starting point is that pacta sunt servanda, we must observe agreements. What we have agreed on, we must implement, whatever the subject. That's the way we carry out business in Finland, and that's how we will carry on during our presidency. Now, moving on to glyphosate, I do agree that we need alternative pesticides, and we must develop new safe pesticides, and we have new technologies in agriculture where pesticides are not needed. They're most welcome, and these are topics that we will promote and further. That's obvious. One detail on glyphosate, which has to do with the way it's used, and this relates to other pesticides as well. It's not only that we use a pesticide, it's how we use pesticides, and there are differences here, and where we come back to technical matters and different techniques and technologies and the differing impacts of these techniques and technologies on the environment. And that's important to us. Animal welfare was taken up several times by various MEPs. It's a big thing. We must take care that whether we're talking about Mercosur, export of live animals, or raising animals, animal husbandry, we must respect animals and animal welfare. That's our starting point. And if this doesn't happen, we must take action. And I'm reiterating that pacta sunt servanda, and rules must be respected, and we must demand others to do so. And then coming back to Mercosur and things that it may involve, there are these safety clauses which must be observed. There's a safety clause on antimicrobial resistance as well. And there was a question on antimicrobial medicines. Am I in favor of using them in a preventive sense? No, I'm against that. Antimicrobial medication is used for treating illnesses. They are not a preventive measure. To prevent illnesses, we must take care of animal welfare and other related topics. Otherwise, we end up in a situation when antimicrobial substances no longer work, and that's very worrying for us. And then it's very important that antimicrobial substances and resistance came up. It's very important. And then moving on, consumers want to know what their products are made of, what are the processes and procedures behind them, and antimicrobial resistance is part of it. CAP and ambition. I believe that the CAP is an ambitious policy. So as regards the ambitions of CAP in relation to environment matters, I do believe that the ambition is there, and then we were promoting and furthering our common agricultural policy. We must stick to our ambition. And I say for the third time that we must see to that when we increase ambitions, we must not reduce funding. Ambition and funding must go hand in hand. There must be balance there. I've said this once, I've said it several times, I've said it before the Finnish presidency, I'm saying now. I didn't jot down who it was who said, but you said, I hope that you defend the funding of the CAP. I assure you that I will defend the funding of our common agricultural policy. I will. We have a spanking new Finnish governmental policy, and it's been stated there it's part of our policy. And then a point on having more diverse funding mechanisms, ones that would reach farmers and that would address the situation of various conditions. It's important to have differing sources of funding, and we're looking at that. And the need to increase the skills of farmers as well. Absolutely, yes. I'm looking in the mirror. I'm wearing the hat of a farmer now. If you don't maintain your skills, if you're not looking for new ways to work, if you don't have your finger really trying to find out which way the wind blows, then things go wrong. We must ensure that people in agriculture have the skills they need. I'm very, very happy about the skill set of young farmers. I've met young farmers in Finland, but abroad as well, and they have a very good touch to farming. And our job is to ensure that they believe in the future, that they maintain their belief in the future, that they produce food for us in the future, and that we ensure food security through them. And that's why investing in skills, research, training and education are very important. Thank you.
So we'll switch to Eric Andrieux from the SND.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for joining us, Minister. I must admit, I'm rather worried from what you've told us. You said, first of all, you'll be presiding over the Parliament for 6 months when you will be debating the CAP and its reform. Well, regarding the CAP and the budget, all the farming ministers are saying we must keep the budget, but we've got 15% and 27% for cohesion. So what sort of leverage effect can you have for regional development? We're worried, seeing the figures we've seen, of the impact of these cuts. So welcome to the struggle for the supplementary amending budget. You're telling us that on the front of strategy, everything's going fine. Well, having watched the Council's work over the last 6 months, I have the impression that everything has ground to a halt. Parliament's recommendations and those of this committee are simply not being borne in mind. For the climate and biodiversity and for human health and food security, we need the CAP involved. So the Minister's plans are just not up to scratch. Are you envisaging revisiting the existing model of the CAP, or are you just going to carry on tinkering as you go along with proposals that are simply out of kilter with the importance of the CAP?
Maria Sora Rodriguez Ramos from Renew.
Bienvenido, Ministro.
Welcome, Minister. I want to speak very briefly on the CAP too. Now, it's true that this is an ambitious reform insofar as the pursuit of the Paris goals and the 2030 agenda would be built into the CAP reform. There'd be greater flexibility in achieving these, but you'll forgive me if I sound somewhat concerned regarding flexibility with the national strategic plans, possibly leading to a degree of renationalisation of what is basically, fundamentally, a community policy. sort of harmonisation in the adoption, monitoring and assessment of common standards within these national strategic plans. Another concern, on top of the conditions applied to greening, what about farmers who want to move out of the sector voluntarily? Would these schemes have to be compulsory? And don't you think the gender perspective needs to be built into the proposals to allow for women farmers to become part of the working world in rural areas on the basis of equality?
Aurélia Beigneux pour le groupe ID.
Monsieur le ministre, mes chers collègues.
Minister, colleagues, the Finnish presidency's programme for the next 6 months leaves question marks in our mind over the path we followed. We're being told that there's a source of concern to the European economy here, but consumers are calling for a more local approach, particularly for the purposes of traceability and health concerns. The terrible CETA treaty, for example, means that animal matter can be introduced into the EU market containing substances that have been banned here for many years. So implies certain substances used in intensive farming. And Finland was one of the countries that was in favour of keeping glyphosate authorised till 2022. We need to search for alternatives which will not cause cancer for farmers, free of pressure from the lobby, which is why France has decided to ban this substance quickly. So are you going to join the countries who are committing themselves to that course?
We give the floor to Anja Azekamp for the GUE.
Ja, dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Chairman. Minister, I'd like to thank you and compliment you on the fact that last week during the Agriculture Council you did facilitate a debate regarding unacceptable transport of animals during the summer months. Millions of animals are being transported over long distances, even when the temperature exceeds 40 degrees. A week and a half ago, I myself saw a ship leaving a Romanian port with 70,000 animals on board. For days, they were left there subject to significant violence. They were heading for Kuwait, and they're likely only to arrive there on the 2nd of August. Now, it's a question of civilization that we bring an end to live animal exports, and I would be glad to hear from the Minister who you envisage redoubling your efforts to stop exports to these countries. Would you agree, for example, to discuss this with a Romanian colleague and ask the Commission to open infringement proceedings? Thank you.
I will give the floor again to Madame Daliowska for ECR. It's your second round.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie.
Thank you very much, Minister. I wanted to be very disciplined and I wanted to be within time limit. So I left out one question that I wanted to ask you. When we talk about forestry and about renewable energy, climate protection, then we have to remember that we have to prevent a situation which happens in one big member state where we have enormous deforestation going on. Trees are being felled to install wind farms. It beggars belief. Of course, you could find other areas where wind farms could be placed without the necessity to fell trees and to endanger habitats. So maybe when we are going to discuss forestry, when we are going to talk about how to protect forests, how to go towards zero carbon dioxide emission, then maybe we could also talk about situations like those.
And the last question by Eleonora Evi for non inscrits.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Minister. Earlier on, you mentioned antibiotic resistance. I'd like to return to that issue because this phenomenon has now acquired a huge scale. More than 33,000 people are dying in Europe because of antibiotic resistance, and projections for the future are far from reassuring. People are talking about as many as 10 million people being affected by 2050. And a great deal of the responsibility for this phenomenon can be laid at the door of intensive farming and the abuse of antibiotics. Intensive farming also causes huge greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, as well as polluting water and soil. And it's also led to a loss of biodiversity. And like 10 million animals are being caged in Europe, unable to move naturally. That cruelty must be brought to an end. There's a European Citizens Initiative with 1.2 million signatures, a huge coalition, the largest coalition of environmentalist associations across Europe, who are looking to you to listen to the voice of our citizens. Isn't it now the time to move away from this intensive farming model, which has created all this damage, and move to a more positive model? What are you going to do to promote all that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So answers for 10 minutes from the Minister.
Kiitoksia puheenjohtaja.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you again for the questions. I'll take them roughly in the order they were asked. As to funding, there were still many questions about that, and that's a good thing, because it's a crucial issue for common policies. Cohesion is essential for us, and we'll stick to cohesion. I could say here as well that funding is very important for agriculture ministers in relation to the CAP, but decisions will be made by heads of government eventually. More generally, I could say that ambitious environmental and climate policy requires sufficient funding, as said, in particular cuts to the second pillar and agriculture. That cuts that have been proposed are very difficult for us. And I will reiterate, because this is essential, there must be a balance between the ambition that we express and the funding that we offer. And Finland works for a balance here. As the rule of development, cohesion is important, as well as sustainable income levels for farmers. And moreover, we need a system that's simple, both from the perspective of agriculture as well as the management side. We need flexibility. That's clear. And again, generally speaking, Finland sticks to having more ambitious agriculture policy, and conditionality is essential. That creates a foundation for a cohesive agriculture policy, and we would expand the amount of requirements that we set for agriculture. Nevertheless, flexibility helps us have climate actions that are suitable for local conditions, but this doesn't mean renationalization. We have common funding, common rules, but we can do all this in a bit of a more clever way. And if you can do that, it would be an improvement, and we are looking for such improvements here. As to animal welfare and long transport, it is a major problem. I take it seriously. And as I stated in my opening remarks, the shortcomings that we have observed in long animal transport, they are not of this day and age. The consumers must be reassured. They must know that the conditions are right in the whole production chain. We are looking at third countries here too. Finland will monitor the situation and we will have discussions on this in veterinary chiefs negotiations. And last week we already made this point clear. European food is of high quality, and that's why, as regards the SPS Treaty, we are monitoring products from third countries, and the precautionary principle and public health are criteria which can be used to take products from the market, and we must have this in mind. That's where we've acted, that's the way we must act. And coming back to deforestation, and as the speaker rightly pointed out, forests are using for in the construction industry, and that's why it's important that those areas that can be reforested will be reforested, so that forests will be regenerated. The Finnish principle, the one that we have had for 100 years now, is that there's an obligation that once you log, once you use a forest for economic purposes, you must see to that a new forest will be regenerated, that there is reforestation. That's the basic forestry law that we have, and it's a good law. It's equally important to improve forest growth, and this is a way of binding more carbon, and that is one way of substituting non-renewables. And then the last thing, intensive production, for example, cages are not allowed in poultry production in Europe, and that's a good thing. All the time we must gauge the situation with the industry, with the producers and the consumers. We must find new ways of improving animal welfare. Nevertheless, we must bear in mind that our rules are such that they ensure food safety, that we don't have welfare leakages, which would mean that we would have food from outside Europe, which is produced in conditions that cannot be compared at all to the European conditions. This is a question on the big scale, but it's really, really important to take good care of animals, and it's a responsibility for all of us. Thank you.
Sauf erreur de ma part, vous n'avez pas...
Unless I'm mistaken, I don't believe you replied to the question on the biodiversity agreement with China raised by Mr. Schneider. Is that because you're going to refer that to your colleague in charge of the environment?
So that will be a question for tomorrow. Yeah, please go ahead.
Puheenjohtaja, juuri näin, että...
Thank you, Chairman. Indeed, this is a question for the Minister of the Environment and maybe also the Foreign Minister. But something that concerns me is the cooperation in forestry, how we can export know-how and knowledge on forestry. We have exported this information to China as well, and this is very important because this way we can promote things in China so that they can reach their goals. I am familiar with this issue, and we have good joint objectives, but it's clear that they need international cooperation and aid. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your answers. I think you have understood what are our priorities when it comes to a few topics: Mercosur, CAP, the budget, biodiversity, and so on. So we hope that we will be able, in the next 5 months now, remaining 5 months and a half of your presidency, to work closely together. And I hope that we will have an additional opportunity before the end of your presidency to come back, if possible, in order to share new information about the negotiations and the ongoing negotiations like CAP or MFF. Thank you again, and thank you to all for having been very strict in the time constraints, so everybody was able to raise its questions. We will move to the other part of the agenda after a very short break. Thank you. Okay, we are going to start again. So please join your seat. Thank you. So the first item is the adoption of the agenda, a tough one. So I guess the agenda is adopted. It's adopted. Okay. So we can move to the second point about some housekeeping announcements. So it's about a reminder of a couple of rules because it's our first meeting today. So if you are not part of the meeting, if you could move, please. Thank you. So the first information to be shared is that the interpretation is available today in 20 languages, but there is a formal ask from the Secretariat in order to save money and to be cost effective that if you do not attend the meeting and you had requested a specific interpretation, a translation, then please warn the Secretariat so that we can avoid some extra costs in terms of translation. So that's purely good resource management, and I think we all share that objective. Because we are all taxpayers and EU taxpayers as well. Second, it's about the electronic meeting file. So that's another kind of, of good management of resources, not the financial resources, but the paper resources. The ENVI committee runs on an electronic basis for all the documents. It's not printed. Of course, you can print if you like, but it's sent on an electronic basis via the e-meeting application. Do you think it's important to share more information? It's okay. So if ever you have any questions on that front, please ask formally or informally the Secretariat. The third point in terms of housekeeping is that you should have received in your own language a welcome pack of ENVI welcome packs as new ENVI members. So a lot of information about the way we operate, the scope of the committees, the files, and so on and so on and so on. So again, if you have any questions or your staff, please ask the Secretariat. And the fourth announcement is about the fact that the Secretariat, of course, changed as well in terms of human resources, and we are lucky to have a new head of unit, Ms. Sarah Blow from Luxembourg. And I can tell you that for the way we have been working together for 1 week now, very effective team. I think it's the largest team. It's the largest Secretariat team for the whole Parliament, 28 persons. You can, when you are shadow, when you are rapporteur, or if you have any questions in terms of legal basis, procedure, and so on, please don't hesitate to ask the Secretariat for concrete and precise answers. So it's very, very helpful to have Sarah and her team. And then also last information about the change that somebody in the Secretariat, Tina Dizdarevich, has left after 7 years in the ENVI Secretariat to the ITRE Secretariat, another story, and good luck to her. So it was mainly housekeeping announcements. Tomorrow that will be more politically sensitive when we be discussing post-coordinators meeting about a few topics such as CAP and others. So we are going to move to the last point of the agenda, the general budget of the EU for the financial year 2020. And I will switch to French if you don't mind. Comme je suis en tant que président de cette commission.
As president of this committee, I was designated as a rapporteur for this opinion on the budget. This is an opinion we have every single year. So as a rapporteur on this text, I wanted to share with you some points which make up the document that we will be sending to the Commission. The first message that we want to transmit is that the 20% threshold for expenditure for the climate, which is the objective under the current MFF, was not achieved because thus far expenditure for the climate is 19.7%, which is close to 20%, but we would have hoped to have been slightly above rather than slightly below. So our request is that the last year of the current MFF should be marked by an acceleration of expenditure for the climate. So it'd be a minimum of 21%, which would enable us to achieve the overall objective of 20%. And then the second point is this. In the course of the discussions in Council, where the position was reached on the 11th of July, expenditure which falls under this committee's purview was cut by 1.5 billion euros. So in the course of discussions that we have with the Commission and the ministers concerned, we must get across the message that we're going to be submitting amendments so that the 1.5 billion which were cut from expenditure for the environment can be put back again. And then another point in this opinion is that it is essential, as the minister was just saying, that the agencies that we supervise, if you like, in this committee be given sufficient means to do their work independently. Regularly, people call for independence of the data vis-à-vis the business world and vis-à-vis science. Well, it does mean then that the agencies have to have sufficient money, and the allocations for 2020 have to be sufficiently high. And then the last point that I wanted to raise is that this budget is, of course, the last one in the multi-annual framework until 2021, and it should be able to, or we should be able to see where we're going next. It's already been mentioned by the new President of the Commission. And this budgetary year must be marked by the priority set out by the new President of the Commission, according to what she said to us in Strasbourg. So that is the fight against climate change, and that should be through the 21% for climate and the environment. And we also need to be thinking in terms of the general alignment of the budget with the Paris Agreement and the work done in the OECD. At the moment, the Commission is not really particularly looking at that. We would have thought this last year could be a pilot year for this aspect. So those are just a couple of points that I wanted to share with you as rapporteur of this text. And putting back my chairman's hat, I'll switch back to English.
To the shadows, starting with the EPP. It's Madame Polfiert. Miss Polfiert, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be speaking on behalf of Mrs. Valian, the EPP Shadow Rapporteur. Unfortunately, Mrs. Valian has some meetings in order to prepare tomorrow's ITRE meeting. Mrs. Valian, as the EPP Shadow Rapporteur, believes that in particular in the last year of the MFF, an ambitious budget in climate action related programs and for the protection of biodiversity is needed to build a bridge to the forthcoming MFF, which foreseeably will have a slow start until the new programs are fully operational. Furthermore, in the context of the political guidelines for the next European Commission launched by the Commission President-elect, There is also absolute urgency for accelerating emissions reduction, and therefore we will amend the 2020 budget by enhancing those programs aimed at supporting the switch from coal to gas in energy production. These are all measures that need to prepare the 2020 budget to focus on the next envy-related priorities in the new MFF. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So I will give the floor to the S&D representative.
Well,
it's yourself? Okay.
Our shadow rapporteur is not here today, so we're not really saying so much besides the fact that we will certainly support you on the need for more resources for our agencies in order to make sure that they are independent. Thank you.
Thank you. For the Greens, I can see Bas Aykut. Okay, so the Greens are silent on the NV budget. That will be recorded. The ID group. I have no name. Okay. For ECR, Madame Zaliuska, it's your third today.
Bardzo dziękuję, Panie Przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear colleagues, first of all, I fully agree with the Chair that 0.4 of unrealized budget, it's not too much, but when you show how much money it is in real terms, then I think we have to look for it and we have to reclaim it. We have to also wonder why this part of the budget has gone unused, and this has led to future cuts. So we fully support what you have said, and we presented an amendment going even further than what you said, because I think this is going to be a starting point for the discussion for the future financial perspectives. We also would like to draw your attention to a different matter. We have proposed an amendment to point 3, about a European Green Deal. This is something in the pipeline, and this has been declared by the Commissioner, but there is no document, there is no legal basis, so it's not tangible yet. So I think you cannot attach any part of the budget to a flimsy idea, lofty as it might be. And something else, something that we have taken up in the amendments as well. Our predecessors have taken certain commitments upon themselves. The Drugs Agency, the Agency on the Food Safety, and the prevention of illness. And this has been linked with more means for increased competences and increased responsibilities. If our predecessors in the European Parliament have taken this responsibility onto their shoulders, then we have to take it up, and we really have to make sure that those agencies have more means to perform more tasks.
Thank you. Sorry. The GUE.
Kiitos puheenjohtaja. Me olemme
Thank you, Chairman. We are happy with the draft drawn up by the presidency. All the important issues are there. Nothing to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members for a short question or remark? No. Okay, so we're going to give the floor to the Commission. Starting with the Gilles Gentelet from DG Envoi.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et félicitations pour vos nouvelles.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on your new office within the Envy Committee. I haven't really heard any questions about the budget, so that there aren't any answers I can give, except that the Commission has taken note and would tend to support all the remarks made. As you know, it's the last year of the implementation of the MFF, and it's really the time when the programs are at maximum speed, particularly when it comes to payments. And that is clear from the programs submitted to you. There's some indicators around, and they show that all the programs that are ongoing, particularly LIFE, are actually successful in terms of preserving species and protecting habitats and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and even in terms of reducing the waste created. And then a couple of comments in the light of what MEPs have said. The first comment is that it's true that we're only at 19.7% when it comes to integrating the climate in all the expenditure. We could agree with what people have said, namely that it is insufficient. Nevertheless, if we look at the development vis-à-vis earlier years, we're actually on the right track. That doesn't mean that we should rest on our laurels, and I would agree that it would be better to be above the target than below it, but we are nevertheless heading the right direction. And then, as you know, we're going through a rather difficult period because as of the 1st of November, it is planned that a member state will leave the European Union, and that's bound to have some impact on the budget. Depending on the circumstances, we're not really expecting any impact for 2020, but for subsequent budgets, we need to take account of it. And we also need to take it into consideration when it comes to MFF. Particularly in terms of the agencies which you mentioned. If we look at the overall budget for the agencies, which supports the decentralized agencies and the Commission, and the various objectives we've set out, there is a problem with financing, so that when we have new tasks that arise from co-decision, the budget is not always there. So it'd be important in the upcoming legislative period that over and above the overall budget which we're currently negotiating, we should focus particularly in the context of negotiations. We should focus on making sure that if tasks are given to these agencies, they also get the additional funds necessary. It's the first meeting of this committee in its new composition. So I'd like to say that DG Environment, DG Sante and DG Climate are at your disposal to discuss with you all the different aspects and to give you any additional information that you might require. And if there are any additional questions, my colleagues from DG Sante and DG Climate are perfectly happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to the representative from DG Climate.
Thank you, Chairman. And I also wanted to congratulate you in person for your appointment as Chairman of this committee. Now, my colleague from DG Environment has already partly replied to the question or the issue on the climate mainstreaming. And indeed, there is a positive trend if you look at the figures. In fact, that we don't manage to reach the 20% is because we were a bit penalized when we started at the very beginning of this current MFF. So in the years 2014 and 15, the figures were largely below 20%, but we have been catching up meanwhile, so that now, in average, we'll reach 19.7% on average, which is not too bad because it's, of course, based on the draft budget. So maybe at the very end, there might be even more than just the 19.7%. And of course, we welcome your opinion, and especially the draft opinion, and especially point 1, which also invites us to be more ambitious for the future. And that's in line with what our President-elect has also promised, in fact, to the European Parliament, that we will step up our ambition in the future. And indeed, in the proposal, the current proposal lying on the table for the next MFF, The Commission was aiming for 25% of climate mainstreaming. And for the rest, we are analyzing internally how we can do more. There is a lot on the table indeed, with the Green Deal for Europe and all the, let's say, funds that need to be established, like Sustainable Europe Investment Fund, like the Transition Fund, like the conversion, in fact, of the European Investment Bank into a climate bank, at least partly, so that in the end we will unlock the 1 trillion of investments that were promised by our President-elect in the next decade. But I don't have to hide for you that this is a really huge challenge, and I think it will require all forces, both in the Commission and also in the Parliament, the European Parliament, which is our partner in this, to get there. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. And I will give the floor to the last representative for the Commission, DG Santé.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will not repeat what has already been said concerning the last year of the MFF, but I would just point on one important point which is in your draft, which is concerning EFSA. For EFSA, indeed, there is a large increase of the staff, which corresponds exactly to the financial statement that was attached to the revision of the General Food Law. So this increase is totally justified and it's necessary to implement the General Food Law. For the rest, we just welcome, of course, the intention of the COMNV to reinstate the draft budget as adopted by the Commission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's just beyond the scope of this opinion. I think it would be good to have later on a discussion about what means for the EU budget to be Paris aligned, because that's an ongoing process with a couple of member states outside the EU, within the EU, and that would be great to have your view as a committee to know what it means for the next MFF to be Paris aligned. So it's not only about the one figure, 20, 25, more than 25 up to 30, but also the whole constituency of the budget. So we will get back to that in due time. So for the deadlines for amendment, if you have any, it's tomorrow. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. And then we will get back to this opinion on the budget in the committee September 4th for a vote, and then there will be next steps up to the plenary vote. I think we are done for the agenda today. We will meet tomorrow at 9:30. I insist on 9:30, not 9 a.m., but 9:30 a.m. So see you tomorrow.